Checker special celebrates some of the finest buildings in English history, from the monumental cathedrals raised by the Normans and their Catholic kings, to the manor houses of Elizabethan England. The fortified castles that kept out England's other invaders, the Vikings and the Scots. And after the Civil War was over, those castles that were prettified into prodigy houses in the late 17th century.
In part one of our epic architectural journey, we trace the first 1,000 years of the English building. We illustrate its evolution from humble priory to stately mansion. History is one of foreign conquest and religious upheaval. It's also a history defined by the struggles between royal houses, the church and state, all of them vying for supreme power, and all of them reflecting in the nation's architectural scheme. And by taking all that is great and good from the continent, England has fashioned buildings of outstanding beauty without losing sight of their function. Our building story begins on the island of Lindisfarne, in the northernmost part of England.
The Romans arrived here in 50 BC. They headed north and closed their empire on the Northumberland-Cumbria neck of the nation, which left them free to civilize the Britons and the Saxons. They gave them brick and mortar and roads, amongst other things, but the subjects were soon left to their own devices. Homes were Romanized, but in the Dark Ages that followed, the 3rd to the 6th century, it was left to the church to give order and clarity to their lives.
If we look to the Lindisfarne Gospels, we can see a rich Anglo-Saxon culture coursing through the rivers of Celtic Christianity, an Irish brand of Catholicism, imported to England in the 7th century by the Irish monk St. Aidan.
King Oswald of Northumbria gave Aidan this priory on the holy island of Lindisfarne. Then Aidan's successor Cuthbert was made responsible for converting the Saxon people in the area.
There's nothing we can see of the original priory. The original one was 7th century, but that was burnt down when the Vikings attacked, and this one was founded 12th century.
And I know Aidan was the first monk to arrive on the island. What was life like for him then?
It would have been a bleak place, I would have thought. Not a lot of shelter for when he first arrived. Food would have been hard to find, so it wouldn't have been an easy existence here for him.
I'm sure. Now, this was where the monks were originally buried in the 7th century. Was this the place where Aidan was buried?
Aidan's buried in Iona, and his arms in Cuthbert's coffin, which is in Durham. But the 7th century monks would have been buried here and in that field, which is just across there, because at the time there had been 80 monks living in the first monastery. So obviously there was going to be deaths, and this is where they would have been buried.
And I see a lot of monastic buildings scattered across the area. Yes. What were the uses of those?
This is what we call the warming house. One of the only chimneys and fireplaces would have been there. That's where the monks would have slept. Across there is the different kitchens where they made bread, obviously, prepared Lindisfarne mead. At the bottom we have the stables, and where they would have livestock such as sheep. And down at the bottom we also have a scriptorium where they would do different writings.
As for St. Cuthbert, he lived on Lindisfarne for some 12 years after Aidan's death. But his own brand of Catholicism was born in Rome, not Ireland. This decision was sealed in a monastic vote at a synod in Whitby in 664 AD. More important to our story, this new allegiance to papal Rome opened up England to the continent, and the English building to the marvels of the great ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. For example, Romanesque triforiums, clerestories, and arcades were added to the priory after Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor around 800 AD. A Carolingian feature, they become a staple in English churches from here on in, and their presence is everywhere. We call this building period pre-conquest. Then, some 200 years later, in 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, landed in Hastings to seize the English crown, and France became the ruler of England's religious house.
I feel like I'm walking up to a castle, high up on an insurmountable hill. Well, it's not a castle. It's actually a cathedral, and a very famous one at that, Durham Cathedral, the finest Norman Romanesque church in the world. And can you believe it? The castle, the real castle, is actually part of the university over there. And see how it's dwarfed by this great hall?
Durham Cathedral is immense, monumental, I would say, and as much a defensive fortress as it was a religious house. Thick walls, a location on a hill. Christian England has learned from its Viking invasions on poor defenseless island monks and is making a statement to all those who threaten her adopted Catholic faith. And there are none more Catholic than the English Norman kings who built this type of majestic cathedral. I'm talking King Edward the Confessor in Westminster. And William, Duke of Normandy, here in Durham. These are the years of the Church militant. The Church and Norman monarchy projecting out of England's cities as a truly powerful and united force. William seized the English throne from the Saxon King Harold by taking his eye out in the Battle of Hastings. And he was swift to ensure that no one would seize his new kingdom. This opened the door for the French Benedictine monks to enter Northumberland, so their Norman bishops could take charge of William's affairs.
So what William did was he gave temporal power to the Norman bishops. He gave them their castle, Durham Castle, and he gave them this other castle, Durham Cathedral. He gave them their own parliament and their own army because they were now protectors, not only of the Scottish borders, but of St. Cuthbert, whose bones had been shifted from Lindisfarne. The cathedral was built from east to west, and somewhere down here is thought to be the foundation stone, right next to Cuthbert's tomb.
The nave came next in 1133, the body of the church, the ship in Latin. The nave is characterized by our now familiar 3 stories of arcades, with triforium and clerestory windows on top. They emphasize the horizontal plane of the building, and this is counterpointed by the vertical thrust of the piers, Norman piers at that, marked by their zigzagging and chevron-scored patterns. So, if Durham Cathedral betrays signs of the early Christian priory and its Romanesque features, then it also shows off Norman innovations, and chief among them are the transepts with their great east and west ends.
At the same time, the Normans are starting to think about making a single unified building out of small sanctuaries. It's no longer Lindisfarne and a messy scattering of monastic houses. Everything takes place here in one castle of a cathedral. Most churches of the time had flat ceilings, but what makes Durham so noble and enduring is that it's the first time we see rib vaulting anywhere.
Ribs are crossing arches held by supports called buttresses. They are an engineering innovation where weight is forced out of a building, not in. It was the Normans who pioneered the rib arch, creating a kind of rib cage for the entire church to support itself.
Before Durham, arches were always semicircular, like this, Romanesque. But they realized that if they used semicircular arches down the length of the nave, they wouldn't be able to keep the nave flat. And moreover, the semicircular arch is probably not strong enough to bridge that distance that width. So they came up with a pointed arch. The interesting thing is, it was that allowed them to develop the Gothic style.
So rib vaults started a Gothic revolution.
Ribbed arches started a Gothic revolution, definitely.
Yeah.
One section of Norman Benedictine monks got into a fight in York and split from the church. They created a new monastic order and built themselves an abbey not so far away from Durham.
And by accident, they made Gothic the decorative style of the day.
I'm talking about Fountains Abbey on the River Skell, near Ripon in Yorkshire, the best preserved monastic house in the country. The interesting parts were built in the 12th century by a dissenting group of Benedictine monks, calling themselves the Cistercians. They disowned the order of St. Benedict because it wasn't austere enough in the service of God.
Their reactions to self-indulgence made them opposed to the frivolities of church architecture, basically anything Romanesque or artful. So they moved away from decoration to the pursuit of function, and their ethos of achieving lightness, clarity and order became the style we rightly call Gothic. The Cistercian rebels were given this land by Thurston, the Archbishop of York of the day. They spent a freezing winter here in 1132-33, exposed to the elements with only straw for covering and rations of bread gifted to them by Thurston. Many died, and those who survived must have had an indomitable faith.
The solarium is the model of Cistercian function. A 300-foot-long cloister with thick walls and no decoration. Clarity of thought. A long line of windows, half with round arched ones and half with pointed Norman ones, all of them giving light to the interior. Lightness in the service of God. The solarium was divided into private quarters by screens, though it's hard to imagine this in such a stunning open space. And it's in this plan we have the final Gothic credence, order. I make my way through the west doorway and into the church.
It feels to me everything is becoming decorative again.
There are projecting shafts and lobes on the piers, probably inspired by what was going on at the time in Fountain's sister abbey, Kirkstall in West Yorkshire. It seems that this disapproval of undue ornament is making the Cistercians open to functional innovation. And so by now, we have rib vaults, flying buttresses, the pointed arch, and the walls are becoming these vertical movements of shafts. But most importantly, the English church is becoming overwhelmingly Gothic, and there is no turning back. The French influence in the Gothic English building was further enhanced by the Frenchman William of Sense, who pursued this late Cistercian interest in decoration when he rebuilt Canterbury Cathedral after a disastrous fire in 1174. Here, French Gothic meets our Anglo-Norman style of architecture, bound around a new decorative system of polished Purbeck marble shafts and string courses, all contrasting with the light-coloured stone Sense had brought over from the quarries of Caen. By the start of the 13th century, the Norman cathedral monuments of William the Conqueror start to show signs of Gothic splendour. I visit Ely Cathedral, seat of the Bishop of Ely, whose authority is second only to Canterbury.
Ely was the largest in medieval times, a scholarly place whose monks attracted the first students to Cambridge nearby and set it on its way of becoming a university town.
And in scholarly places, you will always find innovation. There's a spirit of movement and energy in Ely's architecture, developing by the 1300s. Walk through the retro choir into the presbytery, look straight ahead at its chancel, and behold a striking example of this early English style, courtly splendor, the most profuse of interiors. Ely's largesse stemmed from its pilgrims, who flocked here in their thousands to pay respects to its foundress, the 7th century Saint Etheldreda.
Take a look at this.
Tierceron vaults, late 12th century decorative secondary ribs added to the Gothic vault, and they're most certainly a statement of the later Gothic style.
And these shafts here, these are made out of Purbeck marble.
Yes, they are. They come from a place called Purbeck on the south coast of England, in Dorset, and they decorate the whole of the inside of this lovely, lovely presbytery. They've been here since about 1215, so they've worn quite well.
And these are the rib vaults, and something interesting happens now, doesn't it?
Yes, they change here from the presbytery to the choir because in 1322 the central tower collapsed on top of this area.
Indeed, by the 14th century, the English have created the Lierne vault, kite-shaped and utterly useless in supporting the ceiling. but very pretty nonetheless, and very typical of this decorated period.
And in the centre, where they join, you can see bosses, which today are very, very highly decorated, and they have heads on, sometimes of Gothic faces looking down at you, and some just floral designs.
So now, 100 years later, the vaults aren't just holding the building up, but they're decorative as well as functional.
Yes.
The 1300s exhibited a uniform patterning of design and decoration in the English building. And this ushered in what is the most English style of building of them all, the perpendicular.
The famous architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner observed that the perpendicular was the only English style of building.
The most thoroughly British architectural creation, which was born in the church in the 15th century.
So what was perpendicular? Vertical windows like these. See how they shoot up? The square towers sitting on a horizontal layout. The repetition of arcades.
With thin, sinewy piers and rectangular cusped panels.
And let's not forget the vast end windows and their vertical mullions.
Welcome to York Minster, the largest medieval cathedral in Northern Europe. The Minster's Great East Window was completed in 1472, but unfortunately it's being restored, and we can't see the magnitude of what effectively is the largest expanse of medieval glass found anywhere in the world. But we can imagine it. The window panels illustrate the Book of Revelations. It chronicles not only the end of the world, but also the end of Gothic architectural innovation in medieval England. If variety symbolizes the decorative period, uniformity characterizes the perpendicular age. And here in York, a perfection of unifying the styles of the early English building we first glimpsed in Ely is sublimely achieved.
Your interest has obviously been in the perpendicular, and this is a perpendicular crossing above us and that we're coming into. But in fact, from this point, you can see every phase of the 250-year history of this building, showing every phase of English Gothic architecture. And Nicholas Pevsner, in his Buildings of England series, paid us the tribute of saying that everything that we've got is of very high quality indeed. So from here, you've got the decorated nave, the early English transepts, and through the screen there, the screen that we've just come to, there's your perpendicular choir. And above us, as I said, perpendicular, two perpendicular west towers. There's the whole history of English Gothic in one building. We've reached the screen now, the division between the body of the church and the choir. And these are the kings of England, from William the Conqueror down at that end to a replacement Henry VI down at that end. And you can also see that we've got 8 of them on one side and 7 on another.
Yes, I saw that. So it's not symmetrical.
It isn't symmetrical at all, no. Like everything else in this building, it's pretty chaotic when you get close up to it. And the reason for that is the building, as we've said, is bits and pieces from every period of building history. And the choir was tacked on to an existing building. And the inevitable consequence is this has to be wrong, which is what you can see.
Late Norman period butted onto decorated styles. York really is wonderful, eclectic and insightful. One of the most striking examples of the perpendicular building is King's College Chapel in Cambridge. It's a Gothic church which was built as an act of piety in 1446 by Henry VI. The chapel was finished by Henry VIII in 1516, the Wars of the Roses having interrupted proceedings and every craftsman downing tools during this period. A great open cage of a building with unifying walls, giant windows and a roof defined by vertical towers.
Thing that strikes me about this chapel is the verticality of it. I mean, you can't help but look up to God, of course. Look at the vast windows. There are 26 of them running across the building. It's almost like a glass house. Clear and light, a very perpendicular feature.
The stained glass windows of King's are the best preserved example of 16th century Tudor craftsmanship in the world. They illustrate the Old and New Testament, as inferred by medieval scholars. I meet Cambridge professor Jean-Michel Massin.
The story of the windows in theological terms is really interesting because it starts here in the West. You have the life of the Virgin, the life of Christ, with the passion over the East of the Church, and here's the act of the Apostles. But what is far more interesting is in fact the link which each of these scenes of the New Testament, life of Virgin, life of Christ, has with the scene above. Because above each scene, as you can see, you have the scene of the Old Testament. The Old Testament announces the New Testament, that the New Testament is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. It is one of the four ways in which people understood the Bible and read the Bible in the Middle Ages. And in the middle, in fact, is each time an angel and a prophet, each time between the two scenes. You can see here and there a face has been erased or replaced, and this probably goes back, in fact, to the Reformation or to the civil wars where they were destroyed. But anything else is just in mint condition.
But if the windows are sublime, the fan vaulting takes the breath away.
It's an extraordinary forest canopy of carving and tracery, 80 meters long. It's the only fan vault on a grand scale to be found anywhere in the world.
The fans look like they're resting on walls of glass, but they are in fact supported by massive buttresses outside, concealed at depth by side chapels. The ribs of the fan vaults are also supporting each other, and they achieve this because they are hollow inside, like the bones of birds.
King's is a marvel of geometric engineering, heavy on the outside, but elegant and thin within. It's a gravity-defying hall of light.
We have come a long way from the thick-walled cathedrals of the Normans. King's Chapel was the zenith of church building in the 16th century. Henry's Reformation had achieved a relative peace in England's green and pleasant land for 100 years or more. So the noble Englishman laid down his sword and turned to improving his home. Such private concerns started a golden age in the great English building.
As a surprise, but the story of the English home starts with the Northumberland castles, like Bamborough over there, a 12th century fortress of Durham's Prince Bishops, erected to keep out the raiding Scots, over there across the border. And most notably here in Warkworth Castle, seat of the Earls of Percy.
The most important member of this family was Henry Percy, the second Earl of Northumberland. He was nicknamed Harry Hotspur for the speed in which he effected his military campaigns against the Scots. He sided with Prince Hal, Henry IV, to depose Richard II, and he was lavished with riches for his courage in battle.
Hotspur turned his Martin Bailey framed castle into a sumptuous private residence, and there's no better proof of that than the flag he had, proudly flying from his keep.
On the outside, the castle is built to daunt invaders, but on the inside, it is designed to entertain in style. Here, practical defense meets comfortable living quarters, a symmetrical plan formed by an overlaying Greek cross with canted edges on a canted square.
Here I am, sitting on a stone seat. It is a waiting room. It's a new feature built in the late 14th to early 15th century. Built not for defense, but for the noble guest who's here to be entertained in Harry Hotspur's grand home. The windows have been opened up to give lovely views of the Bailey and the inner courtyard below. It's a bit like looking down at your own garden. And as the saying goes, an Englishman's home is his castle. And here we have it.
If you walk into the Great Hall, you can easily imagine yourself back in the Middle Ages and the huge banquets that Hotspur would have staged here.
You can almost make out where a raised platform called a dais would rest. A dais would host the head table, where Harry and his knights would drink, be merry, and stuff themselves silly. Now, the fireplace is a very interesting feature. In the Middle Ages, we see the fireplace in the center of the room, and now it's been pushed back towards the wall.
Let's move on 100 years or more to a prosperous 16th century England. And where more prosperous than East Anglia?
This was the age of the wool merchant, wealthy precursor to the 18th century industrialist, endowed with money and a fervent religiosity that built this wool church behind me in Lavenham. The wool trade generated fabulous houses like these dwellings here beside me, with overhanging jetties and a crookedness that lends charm to their appearance. I mean, just look at the higgledy-piggledy streets. Elizabethan houses had no foundations, and why would they?
And that's because houses in the Middle Ages weren't actually designed.
You've got to understand that architecture wasn't a profession in those days. You had a patron who had needs, a little frivolity mixed in with his demands, a mason or carpenter at hand, and this is what you got.
This is a typical wealthy wool merchant's house, a common timber frame structure. But here, there's an appliance of red brick in a herringbone pattern.
Brick is a cunning symbol of the change in architecture. For the English are moving away from the church and thinking clearly about their own buildings. I'm talking about the home. For these are the years of the domestic building, and what wonderful creatures we're about to see.
I'm in Kentwell Hall, built by the local Clopton family in 1550. It's a modest manor house made stately by its bricks and gables.
We've seen in Warkworth Castle how Thomas Percy turns his castle into his home. Now the home is the castle, as this moat shows. In the layout of the manor house, the plan is common. Ahead of me is the Great Hall, the engine room of the house, where everything happens. The masters of the house ate here, the servants slept here, and the entertainments were held here.
In its medieval existence, Kentwell would have had an open fire in the middle of the hall. But like Warkworth Castle, the fire has been set back, and interestingly, it has now been turned into a decorative hearth with a chimney to funnel out the smoke. The house is being made comfortable.
To my right would be the kitchen, the dairy, and the buttery. To my left here would be the parlour and the guest lodgings.
In smaller houses, you get smaller halls, but the plan remains the same. Yet in Kentwell, something unique happens. The Clopton family add wings, not quite even, but wings with a long gallery, an extension of living space and a very Elizabethan feature. When viewed from above, instead of the H plan, in due respect to Henry VIII, we have the E plan for Elizabeth. Though curiously, this layout here in Kentwell came 3 years before her coronation.
Patrick, this is a fantastic example of an early brick manor house. Tell me about the bricks.
Well, the bricks in the 15th century became the building material for grand houses, because you can build bigger, and we'd run out of oak. Well, I say run out of oak, we hadn't have enough oak. And we're on a clay scene, so brick is natural. And we now had all the Dutch brickmakers have been recruited after the wars on the continent. Lots of Englishmen came back with lots of money from ransoms, and they brought some Dutch brickmakers with them. So all the bricks you see here would have been made here on site. Always the early bricks are very much like tiles on a roof. The Romans had the same word for brick as for tile. The bricks were never done very evenly. They had to compensate for the irregularities by the mortar. So all mortar that goes in there always finished off with a particular shape. And the one that was most common is called bird's beak, whereby it's slightly angled that way, slightly angled this way, make it look like a bird's beak. Now, subsequently, you'd never have a butted joint like that. But in these early days of brick making, they didn't think about those sort of things. They didn't bother about matching the two up. You see, the courses are no longer parallel. They didn't even bother about having it the same depth, so this stands proud. The people who built this, the masons, were the architects of the day, and all the people involved, the brick makers and the bricklayers, were all probably learners, beginning to master their trade. And as time went on, a lot of the things you see here wouldn't be reproduced in what might be said to be better houses. So it's a story when you're looking at this house and looking at the walls. It's a story of how it all happened. And it's a hallmark of what Kempwell is. Kempwell is an epitome of a particular time of building in English history.
Around this time, Queen Elizabeth was effecting the laws of Henry's Protestant Reformation and doing away with all things Catholic, which meant that the Renaissance never reached these island shores. And it meant that the Tudor building remained a quintessential English feature. The epitome of the castle as home is Burghley House in Lincolnshire. It's a culmination of all that Kentwell was starting to achieve, but with greater elegance and even more flamboyance. Burghley House was built by William Cecil, the first Baron Burghley and Lord High Treasurer to Queen Elizabeth I for 40 years, between 1555 to 1587. It's a prodigy house par excellence.
Castellated roof, particularly visible in the west side of the house, is scattered with classical details. This tells me that the Englishman's home is now properly his castle. It also tells me there is research in the design.
The castle has become a Baroque home. The west end covered with whimsical battlements, reflective of a learned man, with taste and the wherewithal to do as he pleases.
Amidst the domes and pillars, you notice a great number of chimneys leading down to various fireplaces, 76 in all. Cecil here is showing off. Look how many rooms I have in my house, and look how many servants. And this is Burghley's great innovation. We're doing away with the Grey Hall, and we're building 35 rooms on the ground and first floors. Come have a look. Private rooms. Bedrooms. Drawing rooms. The 5th Earl of Exeter, who owned Burghley House, proceeds to chop up the long Elizabethan gallery. And he builds more bedrooms and rooms with views, not to mention space to hang up his fantastic paintings.
We are getting practical at long last and starting to think about the home in a functional way.
So Judith, we're coming down the Roman staircase. This is actually the main staircase in the house. And it carried on all the way up to the roof because people would have used the roof to walk on, to look out over the lands that they own. And it was full of new innovations. William Cecil Lord Burghley was full of new ideas, one of which being the handrail, which you can see here. This is one of the first handrails used in a stately home in this country.
So this is the beginning of the banister then, another new feature?
Well, that's right. You've got to remember that at this time, it was the transition from owners having a medieval castle into a new Baroque palace. So the whole style of the building was totally different to any other buildings that had been built in the past.
And Philip, I see here the Tudor rose.
Yes, the symbol of the Tudor dynasty. I mean, William Cecil was really showing his allegiance to his monarch, his queen, by having this carved into the ceiling of the Roman staircase.
Yes.
I've got something else I think you'd like to see as well. You follow me through here.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, this is the inner court of the house, the centre of the house itself. Well, remember, in the 16th century, architects didn't exist. So William Cecil designed this and built it all himself. And he was trying to show that he was a newly educated person, that he understood the classics, incorporated a number of classical features in the building itself. You can see them all around you.
Yeah, I can see here the Roman arch, the obelisks.
The Roman arch, the triumphal symbol that there is. You've got the obelisks you mentioned on the roof. The chimneys are all these enormous columns, which are showing again, they're almost like a Roman forum that you can see there. And but these little stone cannonballs with flames on the top as well, great classical symbols. And then right at the centre of it all, you have the clock tower that's here.
Oh, wonderful.
The clock tower dated 1585, a new innovation of its time. Prior to that, all time was really done on the Catholic calendar, the Catholic time for the day, through matins, through evensong. And what he was showing is that he was a new modern thinker by incorporating a clock in the centre of his house. It was also showing that he was embracing the Protestant religion in this country and his allegiance to his queen at the same time.
Absolutely.
But he couldn't get away from the classical features. He's got the columns on either side, showing the new orders of the columns.
Happened by the mid-17th century. The building masters of England started to take great tours around Europe. No longer shackled by the Reformation, they finally discovered the Renaissance through the teachings of one man, Andrea Palladio, who wrote 4 seminal books about architecture.
Palladio introduced an intellectual mindset to design and laid out the rules of architecture, which was to influence the English building for the next 200 years. His style was essentially classical, and his objects of affection was one of the greatest civilizations of all, the Romans. To the influence of Palladio and the Renaissance, we see the English architect as a designer for the first time. He's a man of intellect. He's traveled the continent. He's equal to his patron. He is an artist.
Jones was the first artist of this kind. He studied masks at the Medici court in Florence, then took a grand Italian tour, fell in love with antiquity, and embraced Palladio's preachings. In 1616, Jones designed the Queen's house for Anne, wife of James I, the first fully classical building seen in England. It was reminiscent of a Medici villa, which led him to his next revolutionary work, Banqueting House in Whitehall, completed in 1622. A 2-story horizontal block with engaged columns and lantern windows. Simple on the outside, but lustrous on the in. An immense double cube evoking Palladio's Temple of Venus in Rome. The ceiling is uniquely divided into 9 panels and blessed with Rubens's Peter Paul fresco. With Jones, the English Baroque building had truly arrived in style. Inigo Jones made architecture the intellectual diversion of the gentleman, and he was the inspiration for England's greatest classical architect, Sir Christopher Wren, a man of science who had established the Royal Society in 1661, and another disciple of Andrea Palladio. He too had taken the grand tour of the continent, where he inhaled the creative airs of the Renaissance, and where he came into contact with Gian Lorenzo Bernini, famed designer of the Paris Louvre. Wren had a willing patron in Charles II, who made him surveyor of the king's works so that he could rebuild a burnt-down London after the Great Fire in 1666. He did this on Roman and French classical lines, straight, wide streets radiating from public buildings and piazzas. But it was Wren's building designs which caught the eye, like the Royal Hospital of Seamen in Greenwich, where he achieves twin colonnaded vistas terminating in great Baroque domes over the chapel, and the Painted Hall. The latter divided into 3 parts, a domed vestibule, a hall, and a supper hall. Yet his greatest triumph is the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was destroyed by the Great Fire. It's a crucifix layout on a medieval plan with a dome and lantern resting on a colonnaded drum. The dome is a dome within a dome, an idea devised by Michelangelo on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, though Wren adds a brick cone to support the lantern. The cathedral is flagged by decorated western towers, defiantly brandishing the influence of the French and Italian Baroque styles, and a west front modelled on Inigo Jones's own classical portico, which had been destroyed by the fire. Castle Howard in North Yorkshire is also the result of a well-travelled gentleman and artist in tune with the Renaissance. A majestic example of how Palladio introduces the concept of harmonic proportions to a building.
William Tolman was the first Baroque English country house architect. He was hired by the 3rd Earl of Carlisle to build Castle Howard in 1699. Howard wanted a house that was epic. But Tolman wasn't a very agreeable man, and 2 years later, Howard hired playwright John Vanbrugh to design the house that he wanted.
The novice Vanbrugh turned to a protege of Christopher Wren for able assistance. His name was Nicholas Hawksmoor, and together they created a monumental country house drawn up within a domed building and approached through a quadrant forecourt. English Baroque comes of age with Castle Howard, and so successful were the results that this architectural duo went on to design Blenheim Palace afterwards.
So here we've arrived in the Great Hall of Castle Howard through the front door into this wonderful space. And you will see that the staircases are hidden away and we are just uncluttered, and our eye rises up and up 70 feet to the first dome ever to be built on a private family house. And they think the influence came from Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was a student of Christopher Wren and had just been involved in the building of St Paul's Cathedral. And so, although the original plans of Castle Howard didn't show a dome, after a couple of years, suddenly one appeared. And of course it is the crowning glory and exactly what the 3rd Earl wanted. He wanted a house full of drama and excitement and individual.
Yes, it reminds me of the Pantheon in Rome.
You're right. They wanted to suggest that they had been across to Europe on the Grand Tour.
Tell me about the geometry of the place, Jane.
Well, it's wonderfully uncluttered and yet embellished. You can see these beautiful pillars here, carved by Samuel Carpenter, a local Yorkshire craftsman, and yet embellished by the wonderful French Huguenots.
This has now become a very modern Great Hall. A triumph of theatre and space, stamped with friezes, cherubs and carved decoration.
And tell me more about Vanbrugh. I heard he swapped the sides of the houses.
Yes, this house would have been east-west. That was the tradition. And the reason for that was religious observance. Cathedrals and churches face east to Jerusalem, so should the resurrection occur during the course of your church service, your congregation are sitting facing the right way. But here is Vanbrugh, who is not a trained architect. He arrives in 1699 with the 3rd Earl of Carlisle and Hawksmoor, and I'm sure he got his compass out. And he said, but my lord, look at the view if we face east. It's very pleasant. It's the back of Ray Wood, which was then a deer park. But if it faces north, there is this spectacular view. And don't worry, it will be dark because we will have beautiful state apartments at the back of the house, all facing south.
Now, I know you were going to show me the passageway, so would you like to take me?
Yes, let's go. So, what do you think we have down here?
A corridor.
Well, you'll be very surprised to know that corridors in the time of John Vanbrugh were almost unheard of. Vanbrugh was one of the first people ever to bring a corridor in Spanish, to English architecture. Obviously working for the 3rd Earl of Carlisle. The 3rd Earl of Carlisle was working for the King. The King was very keen on the Spanish against the French. And so anything Spanish became a really big fashion in England. These features, where you have a long passageway and you can independently go in and out of rooms, were completely unheard of. You travelled through a house from room to room, and mighty inconvenient it was. When you think of King Louis in his 4-poster bed in Versailles, waking up in the morning and seeing people running from A to B with trays of food, Your Majesty, we're so sorry, because there was no other way around the house.
It's funny to think that before the 17th century we didn't have corridors. Crazy.
It is, and it does surprise people when I tell them about this. They are, oh, fancy that. And yet it seems just common sense, and also particularly beautiful. When you look down our corridor here, at the far end is the goddess Fortuna, the goddess of good luck.
So after 1,000 years of evolution, the English building has acquired the arch, a fireplace, and a chimney, a waiting room for noble guests, wings with rooms breached along a corridor, a stairwell with a handrail, and windows ushering in light with a view to the formal garden, all bound with tasteful decoration. Castle Howard embraces all these features.
Vanbrugh gave this house something of a castle air, romantic looking and glancing into England's ancient past.
In his plans for Castle Howard, he opposed the symmetry loved by the Stuarts and Baroque artisans of the day. And in his proposal for its grounds, he attacked the landscape with irregularity. With such ideas, Vanbrugh became the father of the English picturesque style, which has a great part to play in our next chapter. In our next Building England special, we look at architecture of empire and the Industrial Revolution. The Georgian and Victorian ages saw the English colonial power at its height. With this dominance came buildings that reflected England's image and role as a superpower of the world.